I rent. And honestly, I've made peace with that. Because when I lived in Canada, I knew homeownership was never really a reality for me. But since moving to the United States, it actually feels possible. Not easy, but possible, which means I think about it a lot more now. But why is it that the same career, by two completely different lives across a border that's basically an imaginary line on a map? So today, I want to break down the four biggest ways that the housing systems in Canada and the United States are built differently and why that changes everything about affordability. So the first reason that affordability differs a lot in Canada and the United States is sprawl. Canada doesn't like to sprawl. Canada has much stricter zoning laws and really prioritizes urban containment, which is keeping urban centers really concentrated, building up instead of out, and not trying to disturb single-family homes. As a result, most major cities in Canada ban multi-unit housing in 70 to 80% of residential areas. I used to think, growing up, obviously being educated in the Canadian public school system, where in geography we learned that sprawl was bad. America doesn't feel that way. America kind of really loves sprawl. Specifically, America loves a highway. If you look at different maps of Canadian cities versus American cities are typically built in these rings of highways, where all of our up-and-coming cities in the States and places that have more land opportunity build these giant rings of highways where no matter where you go, you're on a highway. Being able to build those highways and being okay with urban sprawl gives the opportunity for up-and-coming cities in totally separate areas than previous cities that already existed. The other thing that really helps with this is the US population. There's just way more people, which means people can easily move to different up-and-coming cities like Austin, Phoenix, wherever. There's jobs and there's opportunities in places that are slightly more remote. By contrast, in Canada, if you want a job, you have to be near one of the major cities. It's really hard to get a job if you're not near one of the major hubs of places like Vancouver, Calgary, Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. The next way the US and Canada housing markets really differ is in lending and mortgages. In the United States, it's pretty normal to get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. In Canada, the max fixed rate mortgage that you can get is 5 years. So every 5 years, your mortgage rate is changing no matter what. In America, a lot of people bought houses way back when or during COVID when rates were really low, and they're never going to give up that rate. The other thing that changes about Canadian mortgages is that Canadian mortgage interest is not tax deductible. Mortgage costs are paid with after-tax dollars. That means there's less of a financial incentive to have a home in Canada, which is why, for me personally, I decided that property wasn't always going to be the path for me in Canada, and renting forever would have been totally okay with me. The United States makes sure that there are a lot of incredible tax benefits to owning property that just don't exist in Canada. The video so far has really leaned pro-America in terms of housing, and while I am pro-America in terms of housing, there are a few things that Canada does really well, specifically in the lending and mortgage part of this video. Canada has a lot more stability in their mortgages. That's because Canadian banks are more regulated. There are no non-recourse loans, and subprime lending does not exist in Canada. You can't just walk away from owning a home, and it's really hard to get favorable rates that are actually just for people who really can't afford a home. Subprime lending is the thing that caused the 2008 economic crash, and that's because Americans were loaning money to people who really didn't have the money to pay for the loan. Canada has something that really prevents this: the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. This is a federally regulated business that insures most mortgages under 20% down. That means there are less foreclosures, stronger regulations, and no crash when things happen in the housing market. So Canada has worked really hard to make a super stable housing market, but a lot of people argue that that stability is part of the problem. The last thing that Canada does better, which is just one section of the video, is we have lower property taxes. That's really great, but we do have higher income taxes, and it kind of just balances out. Americans and Canadians pay really similar taxes to each other, but Americans love to boast that they pay less, but they end up paying a lot more in property tax, which is really where you kind of see the equalization of taxes. The next thing that makes these markets differ a lot is immigration. Canada has mass immigration. We have 3 to 4 times higher per capita immigration targets than the United States. Canada is rapidly letting new immigrants into the country, and the country does not have the infrastructure to support it. There are very few people in Canada compared to the United States. There are only about 40 million people, and the population in a single year can grow by about 1 million people because of our immigration targets. And all immigrants, when they move to Canada, typically settle in those same cities. Because we're very small, and because of how we've built up our cities and large areas, they all settle in the places that I mentioned before. They don't really end up going to, for example, Sudbury, Ontario, because there's no jobs there, and there's no housing, and there's no opportunity. And that's demonstrated in what Canada and the Canadian government calls the housing gap. Ontario has the biggest housing gap problem. Ontario has the largest population of any of the provinces in Canada, and they keep adding more and more people, which creates a huge problem. To accommodate for the over 1 million people we brought in per year, we need to add about 500,000 new homes to Canada per year. But we only add approximately 250,000 new homes per year. So Canada is doing a really, really poor job of closing the housing gap. They're not closing it, they're nowhere near closing it, and it's going to continue to put a lot of stress and strain on the economy as well as the housing market in Canada. The last place that these markets really differ is in median income versus median home price. And for the sake of making this easy, I'm going to do all of this in US dollars. In Canada, the median home price is $487,540. In the United States, the median home price is $346,000. So right there, you're about $140,000 difference. But the median income in Canada in US dollars is $50,348. The median income in the United States is $70,784. So Americans make $20,000 more per year on average than Canadians. So there's a huge discrepancy for Canadians in what's possible. It is significantly more possible based on the income that you make in America and the prices of homes to buy a home. It's really, really tough to buy a home in Canada. And that median price does not represent what the reality of prices in those major cities are. An average 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Canada in the major cities costs over $1 million in almost all of them. The $487,000 is really weighed down by the fact that a lot of the smaller towns have very cheap homes. So the discrepancy in Canadian income and home price makes it incredibly hard for anybody to see a future where they own a home. So those are the differences in the housing markets. I personally am super passionate about this topic because I really am interested in the fact that I work really hard and never saw it possible for myself to buy a home in Canada. And I really much prefer the US housing market. That being said, it is more risky and it's more prone to crashes, but things like sprawl, lower immigration, as well as higher income and lower home prices still make it possible for Americans to buy homes. Thanks for watching.